The bank assessor's flashlight beam caught the edge of a ledger on March 14, 1978. He'd opened hundreds of foreclosed properties, but none had been abandoned this long. 11 years of dust covered everything in the Mountain Lodge office, yet the guest book lay open on the desk, as if someone had just walked away mid-entry. Before we dive into the story, quick question. What's the creepiest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. And while you're here, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Raymond Fulcher had been processing foreclosures for First Mountain Trust for 12 years. The Ridgeway Lodge file had sat in probate since 1967, tied up in legal complications involving an owner who disappeared without settling his accounts. The property stood 18 miles outside Asheville, North Carolina, accessible only by a gravel road that washed out each spring. No one had maintained it. No one had visited. The bank's patience had finally expired. The March afternoon carried the damp, cold particular to Appalachian elevations. Fulcher's boots left prints in the dust of the main entrance. The lobby retained traces of modest elegance, a stone fireplace dominating one wall, wooden chairs arranged in conversation groups that would never again host conversations. Photographs hung crookedly on the walls, showing the building in what must have been its operational years, though even those images held something austere, unwelcoming. The office door stood ajar. Fulcher pushed it open with his clipboard, maintaining the professional distance he'd learned to keep from properties that had absorbed too much absence. The desk held typical administrative debris: a rotary telephone, a blotter stained with ink, a brass lamp with a torn shade. But the ledger drew his attention immediately. He approached it carefully, as if the book might somehow resist examination. The pages showed meticulous record-keeping, dates running back to 1923, when the lodge first opened. Names filled the columns, arrival dates and departure dates noted in precise handwriting. For the first 3 decades, the entries varied. Different names, different lengths of stay, the natural rhythm of a functioning establishment. Then something changed. Fulcher flipped forward, watching the entries evolve. 1954 marked a shift. After that year, only 6 names appeared. The same 6, repeated week after week, month after month, for 13 years. No other guests, no variations, just these 6 individuals, checking in and out with mechanical regularity. Arnold Vickery, Clarence Drummond, Harold Finch, Eugene Lattimore, Bernard Stark, Walter Pruitt. The names cycled through the pages in rotation, the handwriting growing increasingly erratic as the years progressed. Early entries showed steady, controlled script. By the 1960s, the letters slanted and wavered, some barely legible. The final entry, dated October 19, 1967, appeared to have been written by someone whose hand trembled violently. Fulcher photographed several pages with the Polaroid camera he carried for documentation. The entries made no administrative sense. Why would 6 people return to a remote mountain lodge week after week for over a decade? Why were there no other guests during this entire period? The pattern suggested something beyond normal hospitality operations. He moved to the filing cabinets lining the office walls. Most drawers stuck from disuse, metal grinding against metal. When he finally forced one open, he found personnel records dating back to the lodge's founding. Medical staff, groundskeepers, kitchen workers. The establishment had once employed 15 people. All employment ended in the same month. October 1967. The afternoon light faded quickly at this elevation. Fulcher gathered his initial documentation and stepped back into the lobby. Tomorrow, he would bring a full assessment team. But as he locked the front entrance, he found himself looking back at the darkened windows of the upper floors. The building had 3 stories. He'd only examined the ground level. Whatever answers those 6 repeated names represented, they waited somewhere in the rooms above, in the spaces where dust had settled over questions that no one had thought to ask for 11 years. The Asheville Citizen ran a modest announcement on May 7, 1923. New rehabilitation facility opens in mountain location. The article described the Ridgeway Lodge as a specialized treatment center for industrial accident victims, emphasizing the therapeutic benefits of mountain air and isolation. The founder, Dr. Gerald Dunmore, had purchased the property through a company registered in Tennessee, despite the facility's North Carolina location. Local officials welcomed the development. The county needed economic activity. 3 textile mills had closed in the previous 5 years, and lumber operations were scaling back. A medical facility meant jobs, supply contracts, and property tax revenue. No one investigated Dr. Dunmore's credentials or questioned why a licensed physician would choose such a remote location for his practice. The truth existed in archives 300 miles away. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board had revoked Dunmore's license in 1921, following an inquiry into his treatment methods at a private sanitarium outside Philadelphia. The board sealed its findings, citing patient privacy. Dunmore left the state within weeks of the revocation, his whereabouts unknown until the Ridgeway Lodge opened 2 years later. The building itself occupied 40 acres of mountainside, accessible only by the unpaved road that climbed through dense forest. Winter snows made the route impassable for weeks at a time. Spring rains turned it into a mud channel that destroyed vehicle axles. Even in summer, the journey from Asheville required 2 hours of careful driving. This isolation formed the cornerstone of Dunmore's marketing approach. He advertised in industrial safety bulletins and workers' compensation newsletters across Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. The facility, he claimed, offered specialized rehabilitation unavailable in conventional hospitals. His letters to insurance companies emphasized cost efficiency, flat monthly rates that included all treatment, no unexpected charges, no family visits disrupting recovery protocols. The first patients arrived in July of 1923. Employment records showed Dunmore hired a small staff, 2 nurses, both recently graduated from a correspondence course, a groundskeeper named Luther Vance, who'd worked in logging camps, and a cook. No other medical professionals joined the operation. For a facility claiming to treat severe industrial injuries, the staffing seemed remarkably thin. Admission documents preserved in the county archives reveal the types of cases Dunmore accepted: crushed limbs from mill machinery, severe burns from industrial accidents, spinal injuries from construction site falls. These were men whose injuries prevented them from returning to their previous work, men whose families struggled to care for them, men whose insurance companies faced years of ongoing medical costs. Dunmore offered a solution. His rehabilitation program, he promised, would either restore function or provide comfortable long-term care in a peaceful setting. Insurance companies found the arrangement appealing. Families, overwhelmed by the burden of caring for severely injured men, often agreed to the transfer. The monthly letters Dunmore sent to relatives described steady progress, specialized therapies, gradual improvement. But discharge records from those early years raise questions. Between 1923 and 1941, the lodge admitted 62 patients. Only 18 were documented as returning home. The others simply disappeared from the official record. No death certificates filed with the county. No transfers to other facilities. No explanations beyond vague references to continued treatment or extended recovery. The Asheville newspaper never followed up on its initial announcement. The county tax assessor noted the property's value and collected accordingly. The sheriff's department had no reason to visit a remote medical facility. Dunmore maintained his isolation carefully, ordering supplies through mail catalogs, communicating with families through standardized letters, creating a world that operated beyond normal oversight. By the time the United States entered the Second World War, the Ridgway Lodge had been operating for nearly 20 years. Its reputation in workers' compensation circles was solid. Insurance companies trusted it. Families believed the reassuring monthly updates. And high in the North Carolina mountains, behind walls that no inspector ever examined, Gerald Dunmore continued his work with patients who had nowhere else to go, and no one asking the right questions about where they'd gone. The pattern emerged when a graduate student at the University of North Carolina compiled industrial accident data for her 1979 thesis. She'd been examining workers' compensation cases across 3 states, tracking outcomes for severely injured laborers. Her research required cross-referencing mill accident reports with hospital admissions, rehabilitation facilities, and eventual case closures. Ridgway Lodge appeared in her data with disturbing frequency. Between 1946 and 1967, 38 workers from textile operations, lumber mills, and construction sites had been transferred there following catastrophic injuries. She found the admission records easily enough. The discharge records proved impossible to locate. Insurance company files told one story. Monthly invoices from Dr. Dunmore, paid without question for years. Treatment summaries describing ongoing rehabilitation. Then, in each case, a final notation. Patient discharged, case closed. But the dates made no sense. A man admitted with a severed arm in 1949 showed treatment charges through 1962, then unclosure. Another patient, paralyzed in a mill accident in 1953, generated bills until 1966. She contacted families. Most had received the same experience. Initial letters describing their loved one's condition, monthly updates assuring steady progress, then a final communication stating the patient had been discharged to continue recovery independently. No forwarding addresses, no phone numbers. Several families had tried visiting the lodge, only to be turned away at the property entrance by groundskeepers who claimed medical protocols prevented visitation. The correspondence preserved by these families revealed Dunmore's method. His letters followed templates, changing only names and minor details. Your husband continues to respond well to treatment. The mountain air and specialized therapies have produced measurable improvement in his condition. We anticipate several more months of rehabilitation before discharge becomes appropriate. Month after month, year after year, the same reassurances with slight variations. One letter, saved by a widow in Knoxville, stood out for its unusual specificity. Her husband had suffered severe burns in a 1951 foundry accident. Dunmore's correspondence described elaborate treatment protocols, specialized dermal applications, innovative tissue reconstruction procedures, experimental rehabilitation techniques unavailable in conventional settings. The technical language impressed insurance adjusters. The widow received her letters and believed her husband was receiving extraordinary care. When the letter stopped in 1964, she planned the journey to Ridgway Lodge. The groundskeeper who met her at the gate told her that her husband had been discharged 3 weeks earlier, that he'd requested no family contact during his adjustment period, that she should expect to hear from him soon. She never did. Her inquiries to Dr. Dunmore went unanswered. Local authorities told her that if a grown man chose not to contact his family, no crime had occurred. The graduate student found similar stories across her research. Families assured of progress, then suddenly informed of discharge, then lunch. She attempted to trace the discharged patients. Social Security records showed no employment after their lodge stays. Death certificates existed for only 4 of the 38 individuals, filed by county coroners in distant locations with causes listed as natural or accidental. What happened to the others? Insurance companies had closed their files, satisfied that treatment had concluded. Families had been told their relatives had chosen independence. But 34 men who'd entered Ridgeway Lodge for rehabilitation had simply vanished from all official records. The graduate student brought her findings to her thesis advisor, who suggested she narrow her research scope. The data raised uncomfortable questions about oversight failures spanning decades. Publishing such findings would implicate insurance companies, medical licensing boards, and county officials. She completed her thesis using different data. The Ridgeway material went into a box in her apartment, disturbing and unresolved. But she'd documented something crucial: a systematic pattern of men entering the lodge and never verifiably leaving. The monthly billing had been real. The patients had been real. Their disappearance from all traceable records was equally real. Somewhere in those mountains, Dr. Gerald Dunmore had been doing something that required isolation, secrecy, and the kind of patients whose absence would provoke minimal investigation. Luther Vance worked at Ridgeway Lodge for 4 years before he walked off the property in June of 1952. He never went back. When a reporter from the Asheville Citizen tracked him down in 1979, living in a mobile home outside Knoxville, he'd spent 27 years trying to forget what he'd heard through those walls. The interview appeared in a small regional paper, buried in the back pages. Vance spoke carefully, aware that he'd signed documents upon his employment forbidding him from discussing the facility's operations. But enough time had passed, and the lodge had been closed long enough that he felt the risk worth taking. He'd been hired in 1948 as a groundskeeper and general maintenance worker. The pay exceeded anything available in the logging camps, where he'd spent most of his working life. Dr. Dunmore required only basic upkeep: maintain the access road, handle repairs, manage deliveries. The job seemed straightforward until Vance understood the restrictions. The lodge had 2 sections. The ground floor housed administrative offices, a kitchen, and staff quarters. The upper 2 floors comprised the medical wing, accessible only through a locked door at the base of the main staircase. Dunmore kept the only key. The nurses had limited access, admitted only when summoned. Vance was explicitly forbidden from entering under any circumstances. "I never saw the patients," he told the reporter. "Not once in 4 years. I'd hear them sometimes, especially at night. Sounds that didn't match what you'd expect from men recovering from accidents." Dr. Dunmore said they were medical procedures, things a groundskeeper wouldn't understand. He said the isolation prevented infection, that these men needed absolute sterility in their recovery environment. The story might have been believable if not for the deliveries. Once monthly, a truck arrived from Tennessee carrying pharmaceutical supplies. Vance helped unload the crates. The quantities struck him as excessive for a small facility. More troubling were the unmarked bottles, medications that came without proper labels or documentation. The driver worked for a supply company that Vance later learned had no state licensing. Then there were the sounds. Vance's quarters stood in a separate building behind the main lodge, close enough that noise carried on quiet nights. He described hearing things that disturbed his sleep. Prolonged crying that didn't sound like pain from physical injuries. Voices pleading in ways that suggested confusion rather than suffering. Periods of complete silence that lasted for days. In the spring of 1951, one of the nurses quit abruptly. She left without collecting her final wages, departing while Dr. Dunmore was away on a supply trip. Vance found her packing frantically, urged her to tell him what had happened. She refused, saying only that what Dunmore called treatment wasn't treatment at all, that she couldn't continue participating, that she'd signed papers preventing her from reporting what she'd witnessed. Vance tried reporting his concerns to the Madison County Sheriff in February of 1952. He drove to the county seat, requested a private meeting, explained his suspicions about the lodge's operations. The deputy who took his statement seemed uninterested. Medical facilities operated under different jurisdiction, he said. Without evidence of a specific crime, without a complaint from a patient or family member, the sheriff's department had no grounds for investigation. Besides, the deputy added, what did a groundskeeper know about medical procedures? 4 months later, Vance collected his tools and walked down the mountain road. He never asked for his final paycheck. He never explained his departure to anyone at the lodge. He simply recognized that some situations exceeded his capacity to change or understand, and that continuing to work there implicated him in something he couldn't fully name, but knew was wrong. I should have pushed harder, he told the reporter in 1979. Should have made someone listen. But I was scared. Dunmore had this way of looking at you, like he was deciding whether you were useful or problematic. I chose to be neither. I chose to disappear before he decided for me. By the time the interview was published, investigators were already beginning to excavate the property. What they found would prove Vance's instincts correct. The forensic accountant spent 3 weeks reconstructing Dr. Gerald Dunmore's financial records. What she found in August of 1979 contradicted everything the insurance companies had assumed about their closed cases. Elizabeth Grantham had been hired by a consortium of insurers who'd begun questioning their Ridgeway Lodge payments after the graduate students' research surfaced. The numbers initially seemed routine: monthly treatment fees, pharmaceutical costs, facility maintenance, standard billing for long-term rehabilitation care. But Grantham specialized in detecting patterns that indicated fraud, and Ridgeway's records contained patterns that suggested something far worse than simple overbilling. She started with a patient named Harold Finch, transferred to the lodge in 1947 following a textile mill accident that crushed both his legs. His insurance company had paid monthly treatment fees for 19 years, finally closing the case in 1966 with a notation of successful discharge. The total paid, $63,000, a substantial sum for that era. Grantham obtained Finch's death certificate, filed with the coroner in Raleigh in 1964. Cause of death: heart failure. The certificate had been signed by a local funeral director, not a physician. She contacted the funeral home, which had no record of handling Finch's remains. The death certificate appeared legitimate on its surface, complete with an official seal, but the details didn't withstand scrutiny. Then she noticed something that made her call the state insurance commissioner. For 2 years after Finch's documented death, his insurance company had continued paying Ridgeway Lodge for his treatment. The billing stopped in 1966, but not because of his death. It stopped because Dr. Dunmore submitted discharge paperwork showing Finch had recovered sufficiently to leave the facility. A dead man, apparently treated for 2 years after his death, then discharged as recovered. She found 11 similar cases. Patients with death certificates filed in various counties across North Carolina and Tennessee, yet their insurance companies continued receiving bills from Ridgway Lodge for months or years afterward. The death certificates all shared peculiarities, signed by funeral directors or rural physicians rather than the attending doctor, filed in counties far from the lodge, causes of death vague enough to avoid detailed inquiry. The systematic nature suggested deliberate construction. Dunmore had been filing false death certificates while continuing to bill for treatment, then eventually submitting discharge paperwork to close the insurance cases. The scheme generated substantial income, continued payments for patients who were supposedly dead, plus the original fees for patients who were simply never accounted for. But Grantham's analysis revealed something more disturbing than financial fraud. She calculated the total number of patients admitted to Ridgway Lodge across its 44 years of operation: 87 individuals. She then compiled every documented discharge, death certificate, and family contact. The accounting showed only 23 patients with clear evidence of leaving the facility. 64 people had simply vanished into the administrative gap between admission and discharge. No death records, no discharge documentation, no trace in subsequent Social Security employment records. The insurance companies had closed their files, satisfied by Dunmore's final paperwork. The families had received letters explaining that their loved ones had been discharged and requested independence. But none of these individuals appeared in any verifiable records after entering the lodge. The fraud wasn't just financial. It was a systematic erasure of human beings from official existence. Insurance companies had been paying to keep people in a facility where they disappeared from all documented reality, their continued existence reduced to monthly invoices and falsified correspondence. Grantham's report landed on the desks of state investigators in September of 1979. Her conclusion was clinical, but devastating. Ridgway Lodge had operated for 4 decades as something other than a rehabilitation facility. The financial records suggested that patients admitted for legitimate treatment had been kept indefinitely, their presence concealed through elaborate paperwork manipulation, their fates unknown. The question that haunted her final report was simple but terrible. If these people hadn't been discharged and hadn't died according to legitimate records, where were they? What had Dr. Gerald Dunmore been doing with 64 human beings whose existence he'd methodically erased from every official document except his own fraudulent billing statements? The letters arrived in cardboard boxes, delivered to the state investigator's office throughout October of 1979. Families who'd read newspaper coverage of the Ridgway investigation sent decades of correspondence, hoping someone might finally explain what had happened to their fathers, husbands, brothers. Margaret Lattimore's collection was among the most complete. Her husband Eugene had been transferred to the lodge in 1951 after a construction accident left him with severe spinal damage. For 13 years, she'd received monthly letters from Dr. Dunmore describing Eugene's gradual improvement, his positive response to specialized therapies, his growing strength and mobility. The letters followed a careful rhythm. Early correspondence acknowledged the severity of Eugene's injuries while offering measured hope. Your husband's condition remains serious, but we have observed small improvements in his responsiveness to treatment. The specialized equipment available at our facility provides therapeutic options unavailable elsewhere. 3 months later, Eugene continues to show progress. His pain management has improved significantly, and we have begun more advanced rehabilitation protocols. Year after year, the updates continued. Eugene was responding well. Eugene was participating in therapy. Eugene sent his love, but found letter writing difficult due to his injuries. Margaret should remain patient. Recovery from such severe trauma required time and specialized care that only Ridgway Lodge could provide. She visited once, in the summer of 1953. The journey from Charlotte took most of a day. When she finally reached the property gate, a man she assumed was the groundskeeper stopped her vehicle. Dr. Dunmore's policy prohibited family visits during critical treatment phases, he explained. Eugene's condition had recently become unstable, requiring complete isolation to prevent infection. Any disruption might compromise months of progress. He handed her a sealed envelope containing a letter from Dunmore reiterating these restrictions, along with assurance that Eugene understood and supported this decision for his own welfare. Margaret returned home and continued receiving her monthly updates. In 1964, the letters stopped. She waited 3 weeks before calling the telephone number listed on Dunmore's letterhead. A woman's voice, professional and distant, informed her that Eugene had been discharged the previous month. He'd made sufficient recovery to continue his rehabilitation independently. The lodge had no forwarding information, as patients often preferred privacy during their reintegration into normal life. She filed a missing person report with the Charlotte police. They contacted Madison County authorities, who confirmed that Eugene Lattimore had been a patient at Ridgway Lodge and had been legitimately discharged. Without evidence of foul play, without any indication that Eugene hadn't left voluntarily, they couldn't investigate further. Adult men had the right to sever family ties if they chose. Similar stories filled the boxes delivered to investigators. A daughter writing about her father, Bernard Stark, admitted in 1955 with burns covering 40% of his body. 12 years of letters describing his recovery, then sudden silence in 1967. A sister inquiring about her brother, Walter Pruitt, who'd lost an arm in a lumber mill accident in 1949. 15 years of monthly correspondence assuring her of his improving condition. Then a final letter stating he'd been discharged and requested no family contact. The investigators noticed something in the dates. The 6 names that appeared repeatedly in the lodge's guest book after 1954 matched 6 of the family's missing relatives. Arnold Vickery, Clarence Drummond, Harold Finch, Eugene Lattimore, Bernard Stark, Walter Pruitt. These were men whose families had lost contact years earlier, whose insurance companies had closed their files, whose existence had been reduced to monthly letters and billing statements. Yet according to the guest book, they'd been at the lodge every week from 1954 through 1967. Not as patients. The ledger listed them in guest columns, as if they'd been visiting rather than receiving treatment. The handwriting that recorded their names had grown increasingly erratic, the entries becoming harder to read as the years progressed, until the final notation in October of 1967, where the writing appeared almost illegible. What had these 6 men become during their years at Ridgway Lodge? Why had their status changed from patients to something else? And why had their families been told they'd been discharged years before the guest book showed them still present at the facility? The dental records arrived from 6 different counties across 3 states. By November of 1979, investigators had confirmed what the families suspected, but couldn't prove. The 6 names cycling through the guest book belonged to men who'd been declared discharged or dead years before those entries were written. Arnold Vickery's dental records came from a clinic in Roanoke, Virginia. He'd been transferred to Ridgway Lodge in 1948 following a factory accident that severed 3 fingers and damaged his left arm. His insurance company had paid treatment fees until 1953, when Dunmore submitted discharge paperwork stating Vickery had recovered sufficiently to return home. His family received a letter explaining that Arnold had decided to start fresh in another state, requesting no contact during his adjustment period. The guest book showed his name appearing weekly from 1954 through 1967, 14 years after his supposed discharge. Clarence Drummond's records told a similar story. Admitted in 1947 with severe leg injuries from a mining accident, officially discharged in 1952. Yet his name continued appearing in the guest ledger for 15 more years. His wife had received notification of his death in 1956, a certificate filed in a Tennessee county claiming heart failure as the cause. She'd never seen his body, told that he'd requested cremation and a private ceremony. Harold Finch, whose fraudulent billing had caught the forensic accountant's attention, appeared in the guest book through 1967, despite his 1964 death certificate. The other 3 men showed identical patterns: official records claiming discharge or death, families assured of their loved one's departure, yet the ledger documented their continued presence at the facility. But presence as what? The guest book format suggested they weren't patients anymore. Patients would have been recorded in medical logs, in treatment schedules, in pharmaceutical dispensation records. The guest columns implied something different, a status that Dunmore had chosen not to formally document anywhere else. State investigators obtained a warrant to exhume remains from Harold Finch's supposed burial site in Raleigh. The funeral home had listed an address for his grave in Oakwood Cemetery. When they opened the plot in early December, they found it empty. No casket, no remains, just undisturbed earth that clearly had never held a burial. Similar exhumations across the region revealed the same result. Of the 12 death certificates Dunmore had filed over the years, only 3 corresponded to actual burials. The other 9 were pure fabrication, official documents describing deaths and interments that had never occurred. The pattern suggested a horrifying possibility. These men hadn't been discharged. They hadn't died and been buried. They'd remained at Ridgway Lodge long after their families believed them gone. Their legal status transformed into something that existed only in Dunmore's private records. The guest book entries implied they'd been mobile, present in some capacity that required weekly notation, but no formal medical documentation. A handwriting analyst examined the guest ledger. His report added another disturbing detail. The entries for all 6 names had been written by the same hand, but not Dunmore's. The script matched samples from patient intake forms, suggesting the men themselves had been signing the guest book. Week after week, year after year, they'd recorded their own presence in a facility their families believed they'd left. What could keep 6 severely injured men at a remote mountain lodge for over a decade after their official discharge? What transformation had occurred that changed them from patients requiring treatment to something else, something that Dunmore documented only through these cryptic guest entries? The handwriting deterioration offered the only clue. In 1954, the signatures appeared steady and clear. By the early 1960s, they showed increasing shakiness. The final entries in October of 1967 were barely legible, the letters distorted, as if written by hands that had forgotten how to form words properly. Whatever had happened to these 6 men during their years at Ridgway Lodge, it had progressively robbed them of something fundamental. And when the facility closed abruptly in October of 1967, they had vanished along with Dr. Gerald Dunmore, leaving only their deteriorating signatures as evidence they'd ever existed at all. The medical wing had been sealed since 1967. When state investigators finally forced the locked door in January of 1980, the smell hit them first. Decades of stagnant air, chemical residue, and something organic that had degraded slowly in the mountain cold. The second floor contained 12 patient rooms arranged along a central corridor. Each room held a metal frame bed bolted to the floor, a small table, and restraint mechanisms built directly into the bed frame. Not the soft cloth restraints used in modern hospitals, but heavy leather straps with metal buckles, positioned to immobilize arms, legs, and torso completely. Several beds showed deep wear patterns in the leather, as if they'd been used extensively over many years. The third floor revealed Dunmore's true purpose. What should have been additional patient rooms had been converted into a laboratory and examination space. Shelves lined the walls, filled with pharmaceutical bottles bearing handwritten labels in Dunmore's script. The investigators cataloged the contents, sedatives in quantities far exceeding any legitimate medical use, experimental compounds that had never received approval for human application, substances that had been banned by the Food and Drug Administration in the 1930s. An examination table dominated the center room, fitted with the same restraint system as the beds below. Surgical instruments lay in a metal tray, their edges dulled from use and inadequate cleaning. A filing cabinet stood against the far wall, unlocked. Inside, investigators found what they'd been searching for: Dunmore's personal records, documenting treatments he'd never reported to insurance companies or medical oversight boards. The journals began in 1937, 14 years after the lodge opened. Early entries described standard rehabilitation protocols, physical therapy, pain management, wound care. But Dunmore's notes showed growing frustration with conventional methods. He believed traditional medicine wasted potential, that severely injured patients could be subjects for treatments that might advance medical understanding, even if they offered no therapeutic benefit to the individuals themselves. By 1942, his entries had shifted entirely. He'd begun administering experimental compounds to patients without their knowledge or consent, documenting responses with clinical detachment. Subject C demonstrates diminished cognitive function following prolonged treatment with compound 7. Physical pain responses notably reduced. Subject remains mobile, but increasingly compliant with direction. Another entry. Subject F shows complete memory deterioration after 18 months of controlled administration. Recognition of family photographs absent. Useful for extended observation. The journals never used Ashant's names, only alphabetical designations, but investigators could match the admission dates with known patients. Subject C was Clarence Drummond. Subject F was Harold Finch. Dunmore had been systematically destroying their cognitive functions while billing insurance companies for rehabilitation services. The most disturbing entries came from the 1950s. Dunmore described his subjects as having reached optimal states for his research, physically functional, but mentally diminished to the point of complete dependency. They could perform basic tasks, follow simple instructions, but lacked any capacity for independent thought or decision-making. He'd transformed severely injured men into something else entirely through years of chemical intervention. The entries explained the guestbook signatures. These men had been signing in weekly because Dunmore required them to practice basic motor skills. The deteriorating handwriting reflected progressive neurological damage from whatever compounds he'd been administering. By 1967, the journals showed several subjects could barely hold a pen. His final entries were dated October 15, 1967. The writing showed uncharacteristic emotion. The experiment has exceeded its useful parameters. Subjects require constant supervision without yielding new data. Financial complications with insurance audits necessitate immediate cessation. Will relocate and establish new protocols elsewhere. The journal ended there, mid-sentence in the final line. Subject disposition requires careful, whatever Dunmore had planned for the 6 men whose minds he'd destroyed, he'd never recorded it. The abrupt ending suggested something had interrupted him, forced him to abandon the facility more quickly than intended. Investigators found no indication of what had caused his sudden departure, or what had happened to the subjects whose deteriorating signatures filled the guest book until that same October week. The examination room's far corner held one final piece of evidence, a door leading to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The investigators would need excavation equipment to explore what lay below. Ground-penetrating radar swept the wooded area behind Ridgway Lodge in February of 1980. The technology was still relatively new for forensic applications, but the readings showed unmistakable anomalies. 17 distinct disturbances in the soil, arranged in 2 rough rows, about 30 feet from the building's rear wall. The area had never appeared on any property survey as a cemetery. No markers, no headstones, no indication that burials had occurred there. But the radar signatures matched those of grave sites, and the depth patterns suggested interments made over different time periods rather than all at once. Exhumation began on a cold morning in early March. The forensic team started with the site that radar indicated was most recent. 3 feet down, they found remains wrapped in canvas tarp rather than placed in a coffin. Dental records identified the body as Arnold Vickery, dead approximately 12 years, based on decomposition analysis. Cause of death proved impossible to determine with certainty, but the medical examiner noted something unusual. Vickery's bone structure showed evidence of long-term malnutrition, despite Dunmore's records claiming he'd received proper care until 1967. The second grave held Clarence Drummond. The third contained Eugene Lattimore. All 3 had died within weeks of each other in late 1967, around the time Dunmore abandoned the facility. None of these deaths had been reported to authorities. None had generated the death certificates Dunmore had filed with distant county offices. These were burials conducted in secret, bodies disposed of without legal documentation or family notification. The 4th grave yielded remains that confused the investigation team. Dental records identified the individual as Bernard Stark, but according to Dunmore's falsified death certificate, Stark had died in 1961. The actual remains showed he'd died much more recently, probably within the same October 1967 timeframe as the others. Dunmore had filed the fraudulent death certificate 6 years before actually killing him, a timeline that made no sense until investigators realized he'd needed to stop the insurance billing while keeping Stark alive for continued experimentation. 17 graves total, but Dunmore's records accounted for only 12 deaths across the lodge's entire operation. The forensic team found 5 bodies that had never appeared in any official documentation whatsoever. These individuals had been admitted to Ridgway Lodge, subjected to Dunmore's experiments, died, and been buried without anyone outside the facility ever knowing they'd expired. Walter Pruitt and Harold Finch were among the 17. The complete set of 6 men from the guest book had ended here, disposed of in unmarked graves when their usefulness to Dunmore's research concluded. But the other 11 bodies told a darker story. These were earlier subjects, Men who died during the experimental phases before Dunmore refined his methods in the 1950s. The medical examiner's reports revealed troubling patterns. Several bodies showed evidence of multiple healed fractures, inconsistent with their original admission injuries. Others displayed bone degradation, suggesting prolonged immobilization. Chemical analysis of remaining tissue samples found traces of compounds that had no legitimate medical application, substances that would have caused severe neurological damage over time. One discovery particularly disturbed investigators. 3 of the bodies showed signs they'd been buried, while the individuals were still barely alive. Soil particles in respiratory passages, defensive wounds on hands, where they'd clawed at the canvas wrapping. Dunmore's journal had mentioned subjects reaching states where they no longer served research purposes, where their cognitive functions had deteriorated to the point of being non-viable. These 3 appeared to have been disposed of before they'd actually died. The excavation took 2 weeks to complete. Each grave was photographed, documented, and carefully processed. Dental records identified 13 of the 17 individuals. The other 4 remained unknown. Men whose families had never filed missing person reports, whose disappearances had gone completely unnoticed. The burial site existed because Dunmore had needed somewhere to hide the evidence of his experiments. For 4 decades, he'd been transforming severely injured workers into subjects for chemical testing, documenting their deterioration with clinical precision, then disposing of them in the woods when they no longer provided useful data. The guest book signatures, growing increasingly illegible over the years, had been the last remnants of humanity for 6 men whose minds Dunmore had systematically destroyed before finally ending their lives entirely. Dr. Gerald Dunmore died on March 2, 1969, in a boarding house outside Richmond, Virginia. The landlady found him in his room, apparently from heart failure. He'd been living there for 16 months under his own name, paying rent monthly in cash, keeping to himself. No one knew about Ridgway Lodge. No one connected the quiet, elderly man in room 7 with the facility that had closed abruptly 2 years earlier. His death preceded the investigation by a decade. By the time authorities searched for him in 1979, he'd been in an unmarked pauper's grave for 10 years. He left no will, no family, no explanation for why he'd abandoned a facility he'd operated for 44 years. His boarding house room had contained only basic possessions: clothing, a few books on neurological research from the 1930s, and $63 in cash. The Pennsylvania State Medical Board, pressured by investigators, finally unsealed Dunmore's licensing revocation records in April of 1980. The documents revealed why he'd fled to North Carolina in 1921. He'd been conducting unauthorized experiments on sanitarium patients, administering experimental compounds without consent or oversight. The board had revoked his license and recommended criminal prosecution, but Dunmore had disappeared before charges could be filed. He'd simply moved his work to a more isolated location and continued for another 4 decades. Insurance companies facing potential liability moved quickly to contain the scandal. By June of 1980, they'd reached confidential settlements with 26 families whose relatives had died at Ridgway Lodge. The settlement terms included non-disclosure agreements preventing families from discussing the case publicly. Most accepted, exhausted by years of searching for answers and unable to afford prolonged litigation. The State Medical Board issued a report acknowledging systematic oversight failures. For 44 years, no inspector had visited the facility. No auditor had questioned the unusual billing patterns. No official had investigated why so many patients entered Ridgway Lodge, but so few verifiably left. The report recommended reforms, but assigned no individual accountability for the failures that had enabled Dunmore's work. County officials in Madison County maintained they'd had no authority to inspect a licensed medical facility. The sheriff's department insisted that without specific complaints from families or patients, they'd had no grounds for investigation. When Luther Vance had tried reporting his concerns in 1952, he'd been dismissed. No one wanted to acknowledge that proper attention in 1952 might have saved the 6 men who'd spent 15 more years as subjects in Dunmore's experiments. The lodge itself was demolished in September of 1981. A contractor from Asheville spent 3 weeks reducing the building to rubble, which was hauled away and buried in a landfill. The property reverted to the county for unpaid taxes. No marker indicates what occurred there. The access road has grown over, barely passable now, even in summer. 4 families never received closure. 4 of the 17 bodies found in the burial site were never identified. Their dental records matched no missing person reports. Somewhere, people had lost fathers or husbands or brothers to Ridgway Lodge and never knew to search for them there. These men had been so thoroughly erased from official records that even their deaths couldn't restore their identities. The Pennsylvania Board's sealed records contained one detail that investigators found particularly haunting. When Dunmore's license was revoked in 1921, the board had noted his stated belief that certain patients, particularly those with severe injuries and limited prospects, could serve greater good through medical experimentation than through conventional treatment. He'd viewed his work as advancement of scientific knowledge, justified by the subject's diminished quality of life. He'd held that belief for 48 years, from his first experiments in Pennsylvania through his final days at Ridgway Lodge. The 6 men whose deteriorating signatures filled the guest book had been, in his view, contributing to medical progress even as he systematically destroyed their minds. No criminal charges were ever filed. The responsible party was dead. The institutions that had enabled him deflected accountability. The families who'd lost loved ones signed settlements and tried to move forward. And somewhere in the mountains of western North Carolina, the forest has reclaimed the land where 17 people were buried without ceremony, their suffering and deaths hidden behind walls that nobody visited and nobody questioned until it was decades too late. The truth about what happened at Ridgway Lodge is now documented in state archives, but the larger questions remain unanswered. How many other isolated facilities operated without oversight? How many other doctors, stripped of licenses in one state, simply relocated and continued their work elsewhere? How many families are still searching for answers about relatives who disappeared into systems designed to help them? If this story disturbed you as much as it should, click that like button. Subscribe to this channel because these aren't just historical curiosities. These are warnings about what happens when we stop asking questions, when we trust systems without verification, when isolation becomes permission for cruelty. The people who died at Ridgway Lodge deserved better. The families who searched for them deserved answers sooner. And we owe it to them to remember that darkness doesn't just exist in the past. It exists wherever we choose not to look.